So I've always been intrigued by these kind of cool looking panel saws, and one of my plans has always been to try and use this as a concept for my job site table saw. So this is what I've come up with for my DeWalt 745. It has a slotted outfeed table that is foldable. The side table is a foldable sliding carriage assembly that runs standard issue heavy duty drawer runners, and the entire frame is made up of just 2x3s. Now this build is going to be interesting, and it covers a few different concepts, and it can be broken up into 3 separate parts. Number 1, the frame, 2, the sliding side carriage assembly, and 3, the outfeed table. Now let's start building the frame. The frame assembly is going to be made out of 2x3 construction grade C16. At this point, all I'm doing is cutting the parts into rough dimensions. Well, it was a sunny day, so I took the table saw outside into the garden and started cutting half-lap joints. For that, I used my 10-inch jig. You could also use a bandsaw for this very cut, but I prefer to use it on the table saw. And if you want, you could also use the other method where you just notch in cuts and then knock it off with a chisel and then sand that area flat. But frankly, I prefer this method because it's much more cleaner, less waste and less dust. Now back in the garage, I cleared out some of the small ridges on the half flap. And for the center part of the legs where I need to run a dado, I use my table saw for that. Now this gap is around 13 inches from the floor, and 13 inches being the height of my DeWalt table saw. Next, I did a dry fit, and then I used a combination of PVA wood glue and held it in place with these spring clamps. Then I pre-drilled it and countersunk and drove in 1-inch screws. And with that, one of the leg frame assembly is done. I repeated the exact same process on the other leg as well. Now with the leg assembly built, the next step is to join them together to form the frame. I used a custom spacer block to get all the positions aligned, and then clamped it all up using some quick release clamps. With a ruler, I marked the screw hole positions, and then pre-drilled and countersunk it. I applied some wood glue and then drove in 80 mm long, 5 mm thick screws. Now it's time to cut the shelf panels. There will be 2 of them, one for the table saw to sit on and the other one which will go below, somewhere where you could store jigs. A quick round over to smoothen the edges. And it's time to dry fit and stress test the shelf as well. With that out of the way, it's time to mark the positions of the screw holes. And it's time to pre-drill, countersink and drive the screws in. For a belts and braces approach, I decided to screw in some heavy duty corner angle brackets as well. These are going to be held with 25 mm coach screws. Well, I did post this on Instagram a few months back, and this was definitely not my work for the Carl Pope's Woodcraft Build a Chair Challenge. But that was good fun anyway, and I will leave a link below for that video. Now with the frame complete, it's time to look at building the side extension sliding carriage. To get an idea on how this is all going to look, I placed the melamine on top of it. Now this would give me a 36-inch reach, and that's 3 times the original bed size of 11 inches. And for the folding mechanism, I'm going to use this folding wall shelf bracket. These are made from stainless steel and are supposed to take a load of around 60 kilograms. And for the sliding carriage mechanism, I'm just going to use these drawer runners. These are 500 mm long, and that should be plenty enough to give you that extra throw of around 40 centimeters or so on the sliding carriage. And now it's time to get the rough location where we should bolt these folding brackets. So I offered up the melamine top over here, and then using this as a height guide, I kept the folding bracket on the leg and then marked out the bolt positions. So I extended the whole location by around 5 centimeters and then used a drill to drill out the edges. Then with a straight edge bit on my palm router, I routed out all these grooves. I made the grooves in multiple passes. During each increment, I just increased the height of the bit ever so much until it finally went through the frame. To fix the bracket onto the leg frame, I will be using these bolts along with these washers. I tightened all these up using a ratchet spanner. Next, I offered up the sliding carriage onto the folding bracket and then marked the hole positions where I need to bolt the carriage. And just like the earlier part, I used some smaller length bolt along with some washers to lock everything in place. At this stage, I was pretty much excited with all of this. I thought the job was done and it's going to work perfectly well. But then I noticed an issue at this exact point. That is, when you keep your workpiece on the sliding top and when you slide it forwards, it doesn't go that much past the blade. I tried different combinations and I wasn't happy about it. So I decided to just ride it out for the night and then think what to do next. With some renewed energy, I figured out that the best option is to have an opposite pair of drawer runners which runs in the opposite direction. So with that, you could move the entire assembly backwards as before, but then it can fully slide forwards, which will give us the clearance that we are looking for. And now you can see how this entire assembly is going to work. I screwed in the runners and then I also applied some dry grease on all the ball bearings so that it can slide a bit more smoother. Just when I thought that the problem has been solved, another issue has cropped up. The holes which were drilled on this side will now have to be extended to compensate for the third layer on top of the sliding mechanism. So rather than messing around and elongating those existing holes, I repeated the same process on the other side of the frame assembly. And now for some micro height adjustments. I used some kids playing cards and shuffled in a few of them underneath this combination square to make it in line with the top of the table saw. Then with the same amount of cards, I used that to lift the height of the folding bracket on the frame. And now for the Outfeed table assembly. So the Outfeed table is going to be held on to this section of laminated plywood. The reason why it cannot be attached directly onto the frame is that it interferes with the fence movement mechanism on the table saw. I pre-drilled the holes onto this frame and then I transfer the hole locations directly onto the actual leg assembly. And then using a drill block guide, I went through it. Now using 100 mm coach screws and a square washer, I tightened it all up. Now for the top, I need to pre-cut gaps to accommodate these two miter slots on the table saw. Basically, these slots that are being cut now should align directly with the miter slots on the table saw. For the final part, I use Foster bit to cut out the slots. To attach the folding brackets onto this frame, I will be using these two horns, and they are just laminated plywood that are cut in that shape. That's so as to reduce the weight and the bulkiness. The folding bracket is going to be bolted in on the top. The slots have the usual 5 cm travel in them, which will help in adjustability. And like seen in the side carriage assembly section, I used a scrap piece of plywood to get the height aligned, and then screwed in at the bottom part with these 80 mm screws. With the folding brackets installed now, I use this plywood sheet which will get bolted on the top. With a Sharpie, I mark the top of those nuts so that when you put this top on this and hammer it down, the Sharpie marks gets transferred to the underneath of it. Then, using a wider Forstner bit set at a shallow depth, I made the risers so that the nuts on the plywood can sit inside this. Then I screwed the plywood to the melamine top, and with that the sliding carriage and the Outfeed table is all done. Now let's look at some of the design principles and some sample cuts along with it. So if you are sliding a long board, you can see that once the board passes a blade, it's a bit of a fiddly thing to hold on to it. It's usually a fine balancing act to hold on to your workpiece and to stay away from the rotating blade at the same time. But with the Outfeed table extended, you can see that you can now easily slide the workpiece with even just one hand safely. Next, the slots on the Outfeed table enables you to use your table saw sleds and even your stock miter gauge. Next, let's look at how safe it is to cut pieces of timber. As you can see, the Outfeed table is a definite improvement in holding your workpiece safely after it has crossed the blade. Next, let's look at why a sliding carriage or a side extension to your table saw setup is useful. In a similar situation, if you do not have a side extension support, and if you are trying to cut wider pieces which are over 2 feet long on this job site table saw, the chances of your workpiece tipping down or you getting a bad cut at the end of your workpiece is a definite possibility. But with a sliding arm mechanism, it makes that task so easy and safe, which I will demonstrate it now. Obviously, if you have a track saw, that may be a better use of application, or even a miter saw for that matter. But the point of this exercise is to show the versatility in using the sliding carriage extension, especially when you're dealing with bigger pieces of timber or something which is ad hoc. And yes, that's the storage area for your jigs right at the bottom. In a future video, we'll go through setting up these caster wheels and making a fully retractable caster wheel set, so that you can safely plonk the entire table saw stand down on the floor, which will make it rock solid stable. But it still gives you the flexibility to move the saw around. So that's it for this build, and thanks for watching guys, and thanks again for all my dear friends and subscribers for watching and supporting. If you are new here, please consider subscribing for similar videos, and do let me know what you think about this down in the comments below. Alright, so see you all in the next one. Bye.
La vida solo es una y es lo que el corazón pide. Esta noche te vienes conmigo pa' que